here I am at the family residence in Plymouth, Minnesota. The Hodges. What a neat and unique family indeed it is. And my grandson, my oldest grandson, Jonathan, has made a special request, of which I am very honored, to do this interview, to record certain events in my life that, well, I've had a very interesting life, and there's no doubt about it. And going back to my early childhood, which goes back to Bensenville, Illinois, we lived on an old gravel road amongst cornfields. And I think the most wonderful thing about where we lived is that, well, we were poor folks, and we lived in a tar paper shack to begin with. And there was a swamp out in the front yard and a creek in the back. And so there was always plenty of frogs and crabs and salamanders and everything else that would fascinate and captivate the interest of a kid like me. And I had a buddy across the road. His name was Buddy Hullison. And so together, well, we did all kinds of things, whether it was building tree houses or what we called contraptions, things that we could build out of wood and had wheels laying around so that we could push each other up and down the road. And I remember one of them was called The Thing. We couldn't think of anything else to call it. But anyway, and my dad was a carpenter, and so there was always plenty of nails around in the shed, and there was always pieces of lumber and other stuff that we could make use of, and that indeed we did. But one of those things was a tree house. Actually, the first tree house was only about 6 feet from the ground. By the time we got to the third or the fourth tree house, it was now about I think a good 30 feet up in the air. These things always caused concern for my mother's friends. And that, aren't you afraid that your son is going to fall out of the tree? Of course, Mom's reasoning was always, well, I think that children have a good sense of self-preservation and caution in whatever they're doing. Another wonderful thing that we had there in Bensenville was a dirt pile. And that was a result of Dad digging a foundation so we could live in a house that no longer looked like a tar paper shack. But anyway, that dirt pile was hours and hours of, I don't know if I want to call it entertainment, but it was a great pile of dirt to do all kinds of projects, whether it was underground forts, which we would build that we could crawl underground. And of course, we also made mud pies. I remember we even built a fire and actually did have a pie tin and made a mud pie with berries off of a bush. You know, I think my most favorite thing that I can think of looking back is I enjoyed thunderstorms, you know, in the springtime. And oh, how the rain would come down, and then as evening came and night, and it was quiet, and you could hear all the frogs singing in the swamp out in the front yard. And it was just the most beautiful chorus imaginable. So frogs have always been very near and dear to me through the years. If I could live next to a swamp and listen to the frogs, I would enjoy that thoroughly. And so anyway, it was an adventure living out there in Bensenville. And I remember visits to Field Museum with Aunt Edie. Aunt Edie, my dad's sister, having time with her was something exceedingly special. Something we looked forward to, and especially because we would meet with her in Chicago and stay over at her apartment, and she would take us to Field Museum and to the Shedd Aquarium and even to the Museum of Science and Industry. But the biggest impression on my mind was when we were visiting Field Museum. because it was there that there were these wonderful natural history exhibits with painted backgrounds and artificial plants and rocks, and these animals were taxidermied, real creatures that were collected out in the wild and prepared to create scenes that one might not otherwise ever see in their entire life. But there at Field Museum, there was an African hall, there was a North American hall, and these things just held no end of fascination to me, especially walking into African Hall where I saw this herd of Cape buffalo and greater kudu and the waterhole scene, and I became familiar with the name of Carl Effen Akeley. He was an African explorer, taxidermist, naturalist, and the more that I saw of his work and that of the other men at Field Museum, I thought to myself when I was a kid, I probably was only 7 years old, and I thought someday I would like to do this work. Someday, I really didn't know fully just taxidermist at that moment, but I knew that someday I wanted to work in a museum. And you know what is interesting? I often think God knows how to connect the dots. You know, it never occurred to me that God really cared one way or another about us. But in later years, as I came to reflect upon life, I realized that, well, God really has a greater interest in who and what we are than what we imagine. But then again, why shouldn't he? He's the one who created us, and he wants us to be creative, and he wants us to, and he's put certain gifts and abilities and talents in us, and so somewhere these things are going to manifest. And my great interest in taxidermy took root. And there was a taxidermist, a commercial taxidermist, near my grandmother's house, my grandparents. And they lived on, let's see, Western and Wilson. And Wenke Brothers was only a block away over on Lincoln. Wenke Brothers. I would just love looking in their window. I would put my hands up on the glass to try to cut out the reflections as I looked at the fish and the birds and the trophy heads, and thinking again, oh, how I want to be a taxidermist and do all these things. So, but one day I walked into his shop, and I wanted to take a close look at all of his work. Well, he was concerned that this young kid was going to touch something, so he said, I'll give you 5 minutes, you take a look around. But on the way out the door, I said, someday I am going to be recognized in the field of taxidermy. So little do we realize the things that influence our life, that all propel us forward. And so it causes me to think that, fortunately, I didn't have some of the things of today to distract me. I was very, very focused. But since we're over in the neighborhood where my grandparents were, and Wenke Brothers, and there was a corner grocer, Dan's Grocery, as I remember it, and he always had at that time, a lot of produce came in wooden crates. And he would have a pile of these crates on the street corner. And he let me have those crates, and I would take them over to the grandparents' house, which was only a block away. In fact, they were right next door to Dan, so that was very convenient. And I would take these crates down in the basement, and I would very carefully take them apart and save all the nails and sort out all the pieces of wood to size and so forth. And I just had one heck of a lot of fun in the basement building things. And so I remember Grandpa worked for a moving company. I remember once seeing a barrel downstairs, a big cardboard barrel. Well, I turned that into a rocket ship in the backyard. And so I had fun sitting in that. One of the wonderful things about childhood is we have imaginations that work probably better than when we are adults. But imagination is an extremely important thing. It's impossible for us to do anything without using our imagination. We're always imagining. Uh, uh, well, I imagine myself going to the moon in that rocket ship, you know? Uh, and also, I had a wagon, an old wooden wagon that Grandpa, again, that people would give him things, and so he could take them home for the grandkids and so forth. And but it was an adventure being on my wagon and going all over the neighborhood. But when I got 3 or 4 blocks away, boy, it seemed like I was really getting into strange territory. And but those adventures were always quite exciting. Never a dull moment. In fact, I was born young enough that, well, 1940 was when I was born, April 25th, 1940. At that time in Chicago was the old trolley streetcars, and I used to love standing up in front with the conductor and, uh, and, and sail down those tracks. That was a lot of fun. And so those are part of my fond memories of those days. I can remember as a kid too when World War II was over, and I can still see my mother was a family of 11 kids, and she was the oldest of the 11. But I remember seeing a couple of her brothers come home from the Navy and from the Air Force, and just impressions. I can remember an old ice box in the kitchen, and the iceman delivering blocks of ice to put into the refrigerator. Well, nothing to plug in, of course, and then I can remember a man who picked up junk, and he had a horse-drawn cart, a wagon, I should say. It was a fair-sized wagon, and he would say, "Come down the alley." I could never figure out what he was saying. It took me a long time to try to figure it out. He would say, "Rags a iron, rags a iron, rags a iron." Well, I finally came to realize rags, old iron, at any day. And I can remember one day he was crossing the street. He came down the alley, and his horse was hit by a motorcycle, and the horse was tangled up with the motorcycle. But fortunately, crash bars were cut off, and the horse's leg was freed, and he was able to stand up and continue on his way. Isn't it interesting, some of the incidences in life that make a strong impression on us? Sometimes we think we have forgotten all these things, but now the occasion of this interview with my grandson. Anyway, it brings a lot of fond memories back, and I'm grateful for all of them, for all the things that in some way or another were shaping my life. I was not a particularly bright kid in grade school. In fact, I had trouble reading, much less writing and pronouncing my vowels, and so I never was good in English. And but somehow I think one of the most valuable things as I reflect upon it as we jump around here was, then that happened in high school really, so we're jumping ahead here a little bit, but I can still remember the teacher when I was in forensics public speaking. Frida Siebold was her name. Indeed, she was a senior lady. She taught home ec to the girls in high school. But anyway, getting back to these precious moments in Chicago and being with grandparents and all the things that took place at the house. So many fond memories, going to the park nearby, playing in the sandbox, all those things. But otherwise, our home was in Bensenville, Illinois, and that was to the west. And there again, I mentioned that it was the environment, being in close to nature, and doing things that that were all a very important part. I think these are all important part of a kid's life, to be using their imagination and doing things. But it was quite a day when we moved around 1950 into the city of Chicago. As I remember, it was 72, let me see, 7622 West Forest Preserve Drive. Indeed, another little detail I never thought about in 50 years. But anyway, so I was about 10 years old when that move was made. And I had my sister Ernell, and she was a year younger than me. But it was when we moved into Chicago that I was looking through a hunting magazine. Could have been Sports Afield. And I was looking in the ad section, and there I saw a little advertisement, Northwestern School of Taxidermy. Wow, did that capture my attention? And it was around my 11th birthday, which is April 25th, and Mom was having a birthday party for me, and Uncle John, her brother John, was coming to my party. And what was exciting about that party is that Uncle John gave me a $5 bill. And Mom gave me a $5 bill. And with that money, I sent for this correspondence course to the Northwestern School of Taxidermy. And I would receive a lesson every month. Oh my gosh, it just whetted my appetite even more. But then I needed to have some materials. I needed the materials to mount a bird or animal. Amongst those materials were Excelsior, kind of like a wood wool that is used for upholstery. There was potter's clay, calyrax for preserving the skins, and string, and then you had to have a scissor and scalpel and so forth. And I can remember that package of materials. I believe it cost $15. Quite a bit of money, I guess, back at that time. That was, 1951. And I can still picture that package when it arrived in the mail. I can still smell it when I opened it up, the materials. And Uncle John, oh my, he brought me a pigeon. He brought me a pigeon as my very first specimen to work on, to attempt to skin that pigeon and to wrap an Excelsior body and put wires in the legs and glass eyes and all of this stuff. And I was just picturing how beautiful this pigeon was going to be when I got done with it. Well, probably the most tragic part about the experience, it may be even the most depressing part of the experience, is that I had to take the pigeon, which was alive, out of the cage and kill it. Oh, well, the details are a little bit too gruesome to go into, but the pigeon did expire at my hands. And in that expiration, there his dead body was lying in front of me, and there I had my scalpel and scissor. And oh, I have to admit, the time I got done skinning that pigeon out, I thought it had flown into an airplane propeller. It was such an incredible, oh my gosh, that poor pigeon. Never could it have expected that it was going to be my very first project and that it was going to be contributing its life to a situation as this. Well, hopefully, if a pigeon was able to look into the future, perhaps there was some solace in the direction that I was to take. But anyway, I thought right then and there, I never wanted to be a taxidermist. I thought that was it. The thought to go through that again. But needless to say, I was a very determined individual. Yeah, a very determined young man. And probably the next best thing that happened when we were living in Chicago is that Dad and I was a junior. My dad, Floyd Easterman. My mom was Edna May. Yeah, Dad was Dad Floyd Leroy, so I'm Floyd Leroy Easterman Jr. Anyway, we moved up to Friendship, Wisconsin, which was a couple hundred miles north of Chicago, and it put us in the little town of Friendship. Well, that was a perfect situation. The homestead that Mom and Dad bought was on 40 acres of land, and that was right in town. And we had a corner parcel that the house was on of 5 acres. And oh, what joy! Yes, there was a swamp. Well, and not only that, there was a lake nearby. But it was the perfect setting for me to develop my skills in taxidermy, be it collecting squirrels or possum, raccoon, fox. Uh, in some cases, I had the assistance of a trapper. But anyway, it was not an easy go of it, but again, I was very, very determined to make a success of it. And boy, there was many times that I stayed up late at night. I would start early in the morning skinning a squirrel and preparing it. And the time I was done with it, it was late into the night. I can remember. And I used to work on the kitchen table also. So you can imagine what a patient mom I had, having my tools on the table, and there I am skinning a little possum. And anyway, I wish I still had it to this day, looking at some of those things. But you know, here's something else that propelled my interest. I would bring my taxidermy projects when I mounted a squirrel or a possum or a fish. I would bring it to my biology class. Uh, and, and at that time, I was Adams Friendship High School. And the biology teacher took a great interest in what I was doing in taxidermy. And one day he was looking through a magazine, and he saw an ad of Jonas Brothers taxidermists in Denver, Colorado. And that was a company founded by 5 brothers from Budapest, Hungary. In fact, it was the largest taxidermy studio in the world at the time, the most well-known. And anyway, he sent for a brochure, which was a full kind of a magazine. And it has zebra covers, as I remember. I still have it. And when I would open that magazine up and see these taxidermists at work mounting an elephant head, or literally lions and tigers and bears, and I thought, oh my gosh, I have got to work for Jonas Brothers. I just have to work for Jonas Brothers. And so that booklet was like kind of like a Bible to me in a way. You know, it was helping to promote my enthusiasm in taxidermy. And so I would look at it frequently. Well, you know, little again do we realize, and as I reflect on life, how important it is that we are focused in the direction and that we have the determination of what we want to achieve. I was very fortunate to have a mom that caused us children to believe in our dreams. I like to point out, too, Mom was a great Sunday school teacher all the way from our childhood. Oh, she loved the Lord Jesus with her whole heart and soul. And she was born and raised a Lutheran. But she was a great teacher. And so besides reading the Bible at home, and she was had such a good way of telling those Bible stories out of the Old Testament and talking about Jesus and his life and ministry and peoples whose lives were healed and so forth. So many wonderful stories in the Bible. But Mom put something in us by reading the Word of God. Not that I particularly understood it, but I think it wasn't so much the fact that Mom was such a good Sunday school teacher, it's she lived it. She lived the Word of God. Jesus was in the centermost part of her being. And seeing how she lived must have made the biggest impression on me. And so I think that those attributes of loving others and working with others was just very important. Also, Mom was very encouraging. I want to point out that my bedroom, we lived in kind of a Victorian looking house up there in Friendship. It had a tower on it. And I had the bedroom with the tower, and my sister had the bedroom next door to me. And the bedroom became my museum. And I guess it was rather amazing to many people what I put together in that museum. I had tree branches going across the ceiling with mounted squirrels, and people would give me things, well, and that I would add to my collection. But the basement, there was an old cast iron wood range. And there I boiled animal skulls on that old range. And then I had a workbench and a table. And so that was my studio, my taxidermy studio. And so all kinds of things went down there. Boy, I still have the first deer head that I attempted to mount. And I tried to make the mannequin myself, and it started out with a 2x4 fastened to a wooden panel board, and the skull with its antlers was on the end of the 2x4, and then I wrapped this thing up with Excelsior, and then I had to pickle the skin, and I had to shave down the hide, and oh my gosh, what a project that was. Well, that poor deer, whatever the case is, it looked a little bit more like a giraffe. And then I had these beautiful eyes, European-made glass eyes. And then as I was trying to put them in, I dropped one on the floor and cracked it. And then I had to glue it together, and so that was grief. But anyway, I still have that old deer head, and of course it was pickled in element salt, and the hide shrunk, and the seam came apart in the back, and you could see the Excelsior. But anyway, it's an interesting old relic, and right now it sits up in the attic at home. But anyway, maybe perhaps, just maybe perhaps, someone in the family will enjoy having that old relic. Who knows? I do have a few things. But anyway, I remember once, this farmer was going to butcher a bull, a huge, that bull must have weighed maybe a couple thousand pounds. But anyway, he let me have the head. So I skinned the head of that bull, and then I borrowed a big cast iron kettle, and I built a fire in the middle of the driveway in the back of the house. The back way, the driveway came in into the, as it came in, it went around the back of the house, but around this big old wall oak tree. But it was on a section of that driveway. I had this big kettle boiling away with this cow skull in it, with the skull of this bull. I remember there was a school teacher that was visiting my mom from Chicago. And when she saw my taxidermy studio and she saw my museum upstairs, and she saw me busy boiling the skull out in the driveway, and she saw a tree house 35 feet up in the air in the back. It really looked like a house, too. Yeah, my friend came up from Bensonville, Buddy Hullison, and together we built that tree house, and I think it stood up in that tree for, 26 years. So that my nieces and nephews, my sister's kids, they enjoyed being up in it. So anyway, that was a marvelous period of time there in Friendship, because I was also out on the lake turtle hunting. And then there was the Friendship. They had these big sandstone bluffs around Adams County, because that was once an ancient lake called Lake Wisconsin, left by an ancient glacier. And so these mounds and the lakes and so forth, it was interesting territory for a kid to be in. In fact, I remember a neighbor having an old flat bottom wood scow, and I would go out on the lake and row the boat as fast as I could and duck down and try to grab the turtles before they leaped off their tree stumps and logs. So anyway, uh, as I reflect back again, I'm coming back to this Jonas Brothers, this brochure I told you about. And when I graduated from high school, I had become rather proficient in taxidermy. And I had taken photographs of my work. I put together a wonderful portfolio. And my plan when I graduated from high school is that I was going to search out a job in a museum as an apprentice, or even work for a commercial taxidermist as an apprentice. That was my plan. But just before I left high school, graduated, I could have been about 17 years old, I think. And I used to get I forgot to mention, I got a journal that I received 4 times a year, and it was called Modern Taxidermist Magazine, and it was published by a certain Joseph Bruchek in Greenfield Center, New York. Not that those details make any difference, but hey, since those details come to mind, I might as well speak them out. What the heck? So anyway, that magazine had articles in it. Most of the articles, it was 90% advertising. It was only a small little journal. And most of the articles were by Leon L. Prey. He was a taxidermist at Field Museum in Chicago. He had actually retired, I believe, around 1953 or 54. He was in his 80s then. I mean, I think he was around 80 when he retired from Field Museum. He was one of those extraordinary taxidermists. And but anyway, I became familiar with his work both through the magazine and through visits to Field Museum. And so I managed to get in touch with him. He was living when he was retired. Now, this is around 1956. And I remember taking the train down to Chicago. I can't quite remember how he got to his house. He and his wife were living with their daughter and son-in-law. And they had a home that was large enough so that Leon Prey had a room for his artwork and his correspondence. And he was a background artist. He made accessories of artificial plants, of flowers and trees and leaves and everything else. A very accomplished man. And I wanted to meet him. And so I made that trip. And he had these beautiful paintings of birds throughout their house. But anyway, I enjoyed the visits with him, and he's showing me his artwork and drawings and his carvings. He was so accomplished and a great encouragement to me as well. In fact, now that I think of it, I believe I had a mounted squirrel and a grebe. Well, a grebe is a type of waterfowl, and in fact, that causes me to wonder whatever became of it. But anyway, he gave me some encouragement. He liked my work and what I had accomplished thus far. And my Uncle John he gave me a camera to use. He let me use his 35 millimeter camera. So I got all these pictures in Leon L. Prey's home. And of course, had dinner with the family and so forth. So anyway, as we continue our journey here, our adventure and back to friendship and graduating from high school and having put together this portfolio, I honestly didn't know what I was going to do next, exactly what my move was going to be. But it was, I believe, September in the year, and my mom worked, and she was, I think she was the assistant director of the Department of Social Services there in Adams County, and she came home with the mail. And there was my journal, Modern Taxidermist Magazine. And as I was going through it, as she was making lunch, there was a page where a certain John Moyer of Field Museum was advertising his library of taxidermy books for sale. These were old and rare books. And when I saw that little ad, I took up 1/4 of the page of that little magazine, I jumped out of my chair and I said, Mom, I've got to have these books. I've just got to have them. And she said, why don't you give him a call or send him a letter? And I said, no, because he's probably already got letters on his desk. I'm going to call him right after lunch, which I did. And when he answered the phone, and he said, well, Floyd, he said, I already have 16 letters on my desk for these books. But he said, you're the first to call me, and you're the first that wants all the books, my whole library. So he said, what I'm going to do is I'm going to reserve these books for you to see before I do anything with them. And then you can decide if you really want them. So, indeed, I had saved money through doing taxidermy projects for other people. And so I think, and along with $100 that my parents gave me, I think I had $250. And of course, I took the train down in Chicago and stayed overnight with grandparents on Western and Lincoln. Western and Wilson, I should say. And still about 10 miles from Field Museum, where John Moyer was, and this library. And but I took the train from Adams Friendship down to Chicago to Union Station, and at that time there was still old steam locomotives. So that had a certain special charm, because at one time I wanted to be a train engineer, and I wanted to be behind the throttle of one of those huge steam locomotives. Oh my, I lived and breathed that for quite a while too when I was a kid, until someone mentioned, how are you going to keep the train on the tracks? How can you steer it straight enough? Well, what a foolish statement that was. But anyway, I had a deer head. I mounted this neat deer head, a little forkhorn for this gentleman who trusted me with many taxidermy projects. I wish I could remember his name. Oh, it's something that has faded into time. But he encouraged me all the time when he would come to the house. I remember once mounting a red-tailed hawk for him, for instance, and it was coming down and landing on a tree stump. Oh, consequently, since this also comes to mind, I remember when I was working on that taxidermy project on the back porch. And again, at that time, might have been 16 years old or so. And but I remember, I don't even know why I did it, but I jumped up and I pointed at the sky through the ceiling. And out of my mouth came these words, God, no matter how old I become, I'm always going to have a sense of wonder and interest in all of your creation. Little did I know what I said. Little did I know that I was inspired at that moment. How could I know? I was a kid. But anyway, then I went back to my work. But anyway, here I am. But now we're in Chicago here. We're jumping around a little bit. But I have this little deer head, and I made a special cardboard box for it. And when I met Mr. Moyer in his office at Field Museum, he had his books laid out on a table. And I can't remember, there could have been 30, 40, books and magazines and pamphlets and cards and pictures and everything else. And he said, you're not looking at these books very carefully. And I said, Mr. Moyer, I want these books so bad I can taste them. And then he settled on a price, $250. Now, mind you, he wanted $100 just for one book and $50 for another. But for $250, he let me have it all. And that was all the money I had in my pocket, was $250. And of course, the the streetcar fare to get back to my grandparents' house before I got back to Union Station and back up to Friendship, Wisconsin. But I'm getting a little ahead of myself here. But after we settled on the purchase of the taxidermy books, he said, "Well, let's see your taxidermy." And at that point, I took that deer head out of the box and I handed it over to him, and he sat back in his desk chair and he held it up in the air and he turned it and he looked at it and he says, "This is much better than what I thought it was going to be." He said, "You're probably one of few young men, maybe out of a couple hundred, the first one I've ever met that I have thought it is really worth giving an opportunity to." He said, "I belong to the Audubon Society." In fact, he said, "For a couple months each year, maybe about 3 months, I will travel for the Audubon Society. I travel out from Field Museum, and I go on leave, and I travel for Audubon." And he said, "Shortly, I'm going to be on one of these Audubon trips to Denver, Colorado. I will be speaking at the Denver Museum of Natural History. But," he said, "I happen to be personal friends with Coleman Jonas, the founder of Jonas Brothers Taxidermists in Denver." And of course, I had been reading all about them and going through that brochure that my biology teacher had given me. It was so anchored in my mind, the desire. It moves me emotionally and to tears to talk about this. But my dream, Mom said, "Believe in your dream." And I wanted to work for Jonas Brothers. And he went to Denver and he made an introduction for me with Coleman Jonas. And he says, "Now when they write to you, I'm going to place it in your hands and you take up correspondence." And Coleman put the correspondence in the hands of his grandson, who is now head of the taxidermy department, and he communicated with me, and he did everything to discourage me to come to Denver because he thought, well, I was just a kid in a little town and I might get homesick. But he said, "Later on, you were the most determined individual to get here that I ever knew." And so anyway, I think it was about April 1959 that I was on my way out to Denver. And it came about, I had to take care of everything at home and put my room and workshop and clean up things before I left home so it was neat and orderly. So Mom didn't have to be concerned about anything. And I remember getting my railroad ticket. And I can remember a photograph that I have somewhere. And I have an old suitcase I had, not very big, with a belt wrapped around it to hold it together. And there's a picture of me in front of that old railroad station in Adams, waiting for the train into Chicago. And arrived at Union Station, and I remember Uncle John in Des Plaines, which wasn't too far from Bensenville. But I stayed overnight at Uncle John's house, on Uncle John and Aunt Inga, and there were my cousins as well there. And you got to remember, this is 1959, and my dad, who was a carpenter and worked on building projects in Chicago, well, he joined up with us at Uncle John and Aunt Inga's home. And so my dad and Uncle John together drove me down to Union Station in Chicago. It was early in the morning, and of course Union Station was quite an awesome sight. I got to blow my nose here. But to see those big steam locomotives at that time, oh my gosh. And anyway, I'm taking the train to Denver, Colorado. And when I got aboard the train, and as the train was pulling out of the station, and I looked out the window, and there was Dad and Uncle John, and my dad was in tears. That moved me deeply. His son was on his way to fulfill his dream to work with Jonas Brothers. And when I arrived in Denver, Colorado, hours later, and it was wonderful seeing the countryside go by and the ding, 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 ding as we went through the towns. And there were relatives in Boulder, Colorado, which was about 20 miles from Denver. And so they were at the train station waiting for me. Uncle Bob and Aunt Agnes. Oh, it was so exciting because there I am out in Denver, Colorado, and now here I am to be established with Jonas Brothers. Well, I had to find a place to live, and so Uncle Bob and Aunt Agnes helped me to do that, and I found a neat old mansion, a boarding house, only about 3 blocks away from Jonas Brothers Taxidermy Studio, which, by the way, was only about a mile from the state capitol with its gold dome. And Jonas Brothers was at 1037 South Broadway. Indeed, they were in a 3-story building. They were both had a furrier department on the first level, and then where they made the fur coats and on the second level, and taxidermy on the third level. But anyway, the old Mortensen Mansion, as I remember it now, yes, the Mortensen Manor, that was the boarding house. And the population of guys that stayed there, at that time it was only guys, and but there could be anywhere from maybe 10 to 15 fellows that would live there. And I remember it was a Swedish couple that operated the place, and when she had a baby to take care of, and she asked me one day, she said, if I were to pay you, she said, would you be willing to clean up the kitchen for me every evening and clean all the pots and pans and dishes and everything else? Well, you know, this saved me a little bit of money, so of course I took advantage of it and I enjoyed it. So at the end of the day, at Jonas Brothers, and after she made a nice meal. Boy, it wasn't an ordinary boarding house by any stretch of the imagination. But anyway, every night I did the dishes, and that helped me save a little bit. So that was great. And then it was only a 3-block walk to get over to Jonas Brothers. So anyway, of course, here's the interesting part now. I was with Jonas Brothers for 2 years, and I started out in the forms department. Now, at that time, the forms were made out of laminated paper, and there was kind of a garage next to the main building, and that's where they had all the plaster of Paris molds. See, how it worked is is taxidermy. The animal was first sculpted in clay, so they did a lot of trophy heads. So the deer head, the antelope, the buffalo was sculpted in clay over the skull of the animal, and then the plaster mold was made from that, and then from the plaster mold we would lay in layers of red rosin building paper, which was all held together with dextrin paste and plaster. So my hands were red from the paper and working at this metal covered bench, and boy, it was a trick knowing how to rip that paper and how to lay it in the mold and crisscross it so when you took the mannequin out of the mold that it came out in one piece. You know, like I did a rug shell of a coyote, and when I pulled it out, the nose was still in the mold. So there was some discouraging moments. Now, it sounds like a lot of money back then because we didn't have the inflation that we do now, but I made 95 cents an hour. Well, I made just enough, of course, so that I could afford to live in the boarding house and so forth. But I was down in that forms department for, I believe it was for nearly 3 months. And then I got word that a position opened up in the taxidermy department. And so my early days there in the taxidermy department in that first year, I was in the novelty department. Well, I did such things as make elephant feet into wastebaskets. Doesn't that sound exciting? Or an ostrich foot floor lamp. Or making deer feet into gun racks. And then I also had the project of boiling the water for making an arsenic solution, which I had to stir sal soda with to get the arsenic to dissolve in the water. And then I would pour this into a barrel. And that's where all the taxidermists, there were 16 taxidermists on staff there, and they would dunk the hides into this arsenic solution as kind of a moth-proofing agent. So when you took your deer head home, or your buffalo head or antelope or whatever it might be, that the bugs weren't going to attack it and eat it to pieces. Well, at that time, we didn't have the rules and the regulations we do today. Can you imagine having an open pan on a stove boiling arsenic water? And then, of course, I had my hands in the arsenic water. Now, another one of my tasks was all of these taxidermists, when they mounted a trophy head, they would cover that paper mannequin, which they had up on a pedestal. They would cover the mannequin with a hide paste that was made with dextrin and asbestos and whiting. Well, each taxidermist, 16 of them, wanted their paste a little different consistency. So you can imagine what a project that was. But whenever they needed a 5-bucket pail of paste, I was in this little room that probably measured, who knows, maybe about 12 feet by 12 feet. And of course, dust was floating all around, the dextrin dust and the asbestos floating around and the whiting. And I was breathing that in for, who knows, maybe a year. Never suffered any consequences as of it. But anyway, then after about maybe 6 months, maybe almost a year, they transferred me, because you see, they had other young men coming in. Sometimes they had a big turnover. But anyway, so, oh, by the way, then when I mounted an elephant foot into the wastebasket, I would have to polish its toenails. So we had a big grinder, probably down this round, little flaps of sandpaper around it, and I would have to carefully take the elephant's toenails, holding that big foot, and grind, or I should say sand, and polish those toenails. Well, anyway, and then put a copper liner inside the elephant foot. Oh, I should take you a little further. These elephant feet, when they came in from an expedition to Africa in a big crate, were as hard as flint, as a piece of granite, and I would have to soak them in a salt brine to soften them up. And then when they were soft enough, I then would have to clean any additional tissue that might be inside the foot out, and then screw the foot down to a wooden platform about 2 feet square, and then put a wooden block in the bottom of the foot in order for the screws to come up from the bottom to hold the foot onto that wooden platform. Then I would fill the foot full of sand. And I had a special air hammer to pack that sand into the elephant's foot, and then put a wooden piece in the top and put tacks around it, and then dry the foot under heat lamps. That might take a couple weeks, maybe a month. Then I'd have to empty out the sand out of the foot and then put a heat lamp in the inside of it to further dry it. Well, anyway, I did elephant feet into the wastebaskets and to trays to put on a table to put your potato chips in. And I made rhino feet into humidors for men who smoked pipes for their tobacco. It was just amazing, the variety of things. I think probably one of the challenging projects, as I remember it, someone sent a lemming skin. Now, a lemming is like a mouse, and it lives in Alaska by the millions. But anyway, this hunter caught one of these lemmings, and he skinned it out, and it was a little flat skin sent to Jonas Brothers in an envelope. And they wanted me to mount that thing and create a diorama for it. Well, needless to say, I carved a little wooden body out of balsa wood, and I managed to soften up that skin in a little salt brine, and I mounted it successfully. Wow, what a project. Then one of the other big projects was this guy wanted, I think, a half a dozen or more iguanas mounted. These are green iguanas, and they measured probably about 4 and 5 feet long. And so I had 8 of those to mount, and they were just skinned out, wrinkled mess. And I had to soak them up, and I had to take measurements from the skin, and then I carved balsa wood bodies, and I put wires through the body for the legs, and then I had to wrap the legs and fit the skin on several times until I had the body perfect. So anyway, I mounted all of those iguanas very successfully. Well, by that time, I graduated again to another plateau of taxidermy in which I was mounting the heads on rugs. So I was literally mounting the head of a tiger or the head of a lion or a head of a Kodiak bear or a black bear or a lynx or a raccoon. I was mounting all these different variety of animal heads on rugs. Then when my part was done, then that full skin with the head mounted would go over to the rug department. And there they would put on the felt lining and padding under the skin. And then it would be shipped out to the owner. Well, I worked at an old bench that was probably as old as Jonas Brothers. They were founded, by the way, in, let's see, 1908. And here I was now in 1959, when I worked there until May of 1961. But in that last year, we were all moved to new benches. So I had a brand new bench, and I can still picture it. I got a picture of it before I left. And when yes, I got to go a little further here. A year before I left Jonas Brothers, and actually during that time, and we worked a 6-day week, but every month I would take 1 day off and visit the Denver Museum of Natural History, because there they had a full museum program. Background artists were painting the backgrounds, and plant modelers were making the flowers and the plants and the grasses, and taxidermists, I remember, were mounting a group of elephant seals. And all of these things, all of the staff, they had a full staff, and all of this taxidermy and activity going on. And I remember I used to dress up in a suit and a tie and visit the Denver Museum and have the most wonderful conversations with all these people. Well, you see, over 2 years, it got into my blood. I didn't want to work in a commercial studio for the rest of my life. I wanted to work in a museum, because the museum was an educational experience. You were creating something to be seen by thousands of school children and parents and with their families and so forth. And so I wanted to be involved in a museum. Well, I decided during my last year at Jonas that I had to make a journey. And I decided that that journey that I was going to make was going to be from Denver, Colorado to New York City, and from there to Washington, D.C.